I was just thinking, we're all wary of the general understanding that the guy with the hammer in his hand sees nothing but nails. So logically, a divinity school is going to look at the marathon event and see nothing but theology or religion or God twisted one way or the other. But we're on to that danger. I mean, the last thing I want to presume, or I'm so ashamed of in a certain way in our media, is the association automatically with some intention in Islam, some training in Islam, some purpose in Islam. But it goes without saying that we don't presume any such thing. It's a rich subject, though, and full of implications about the real world that religion lives in. Dean Hempton, I wonder if you'd be so kind as to start us off. I much admired your piece on the Divinity Bulletin about the fog of religious conflict and other comments you've been making.
So, thanks very much. Yeah, the only real expertise I have in this is just having lived through the troubles in Northern Ireland and up to Queen's University in Belfast as a young undergraduate in 1970. And the next 4 years were 4 of the worst years of violence in the Troubles. There were over 1,000 people killed and enormous number of bombs. I think I said on a previous occasion there were 22 bombs in Belfast one Friday afternoon in 1972 in the space of 75 minutes. So it was a heavily bombed city. What I learned from my days as an undergraduate and then when I went back as a young college professor to Queen's through the 1980s and 90s was that I think as Chris Lydon has already indicated, the conflict that I was familiar with in Northern Ireland was multifaceted and quite deep. It had long historical roots. Religion was only one part of it. It's often called a religious conflict with Protestants against Roman Catholics. In fact, that was only one of many, many, many dimensions that had to do with competing nationalisms, different cultural traditions and sporting interests, different access to economic opportunity, different access to policing and security forces, different loyalties, and many, many other areas. And of course, most people were educated separately up to the age of 18. So it was quite a divided society in that regard. A few things I learned from those experiences, I think, was just the shock of living in what seemed to be a reasonably sophisticated Western democracy and see it unravel pretty quickly. In the 60s, all seemed not too bad. By 1970, 71, things looked pretty awful. I guess other things I learned were the danger of stereotyping people, the recognition that violence does radicalize people. People become more extreme as a result of violence. The need to keep double-checking one's own moral choices and views so that you were not just simply following in line with what your family tradition or what your selected media told you, but to try and see events from the other side. That became very important to me, and began to see that there were 2 views of what the conflict was about, at least. And then maybe one final thing before moving on is that living in a society which was so afflicted by bombs and violence put real pressure on legal processes. And of course, real mistakes were made in Northern Ireland. Internment without trial was brought in during the Troubles. It was a mistake. It was implemented almost as a sectarian policy. Almost all the early people interned without trial were Roman Catholics, often based on faulty intelligence. It became a recruiting device for paramilitary organizations. Even as we sort of, face up to this very different kind of bombing, I think, and I don't want to draw too many parallels because this is a very different event, I think, in Boston. from what I was accustomed to in Belfast. But even in facing up to that, I think one of the things I've learned is just to patiently take time to think of its implications, not to overreact in terms of changing legal processes and all of that. Those things often turn out to be mistakes in the long run. So those are just a few. I suppose one other thing that does relate a bit more closely to the Boston bombings, and with this I'll finish, is that it became clear to me that some of the most dangerous people in societies are young males who are not economically or culturally or politically attached to their societies, and therefore are particularly vulnerable, either in the case of Northern Ireland to being recruited by paramilitary organizations, or in other kinds of violence having other avenues. But that segment of society, young disaffected males who are not tied into social structures and community networks in proper ways, or who have lingering senses of oppressions or fears or whatever, those people can be, I think, in a particularly difficult situation, and can be therefore in dangerous situations given the right circumstances around them, or the wrong circumstances around them, which I think is the better way to phrase it. So.
Thank you. It's a good start. Jocelyne Cesari, what does a scholar of Islam make of all this?
I think that Islam as a theology or the religious tradition may not be the right point to start to understand what happened 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. I would like to bring up more sociological and ideological reasons, not to confuse with theology. First, the 3 points I would like to make are all related to research I have done and others have done through the Islam in the West program, either in Europe or in the US. And the first thing that has to be emphasized is that Islamic communities and Islamic organizations are not a nest for radicalization. Actually, quite the opposite. What we know through studies of different kind is that Islamic organizations are a very good way to prevent radicalization. And we have studies that show that the more you are part of a congregation, the more you are integrated in your environment, which sounds a little counterintuitive. Can you hear me? Oh, so I'm going to repeat. The more you are involved in a congregation, the more you are integrated in your social and political environment. And this is not true only for Muslims, it's true for all religious groups, and surveys show this very beautifully across traditions. So these two young men were attending services at mosques, but they were not part of the congregation. And I think this makes a big difference. Again, it's not coming and sitting in the pew in the case of church, or going and doing your salat on Friday that makes you an active member of a congregation. And what we know is that mosques, especially in the US, even more than in Europe, are very intolerant toward radicalization. You have all heard about the incident where the older brother, Tamerlan, was actually kicked out of the mosque here on Prospect Street because he had some kind of eruption of rage against the imam, was referring to Martin Luther King as a model to emulate. So this is not specific to the Boston Mosque. You can find this kind of reactions and rejection across Islamic communities. So the first move would be to look closer to Islamic organized community as a potential risk for radicalization. What we know is the opposite. And interestingly, this kind of knowledge starts coming slowly to law enforcement agencies who are realizing that they may have to work with Islamic leaders instead of trying to push them away. And this message is starting to gain ground in the US and at some point in the UK, much, much less, I would say, in continental Europe for a reason that are beyond this topic. So this is the first point. So then you can argue, so what happened then? What's the reason why? What are the motivation behind this radicalization process? So what we know again is that the reasons are related to confusing identity. Dean just mentioned the disaffection. The studies in Europe and in the US show that there is a factor at risk, which is called disembeddedness. Sorry to throw such a abstract term, but if I can unpack it, what is to be disembedded? To be disembedded is to have a sense of alienation that from your own community of reference. I mean, the disembedded Muslim or any believer in this matter felt that is not like the other Muslims. The second element is to have a sense of ontological insecurity within the world at large. So a disembedded believer perceives the non-believers around him, and in this case the non-Muslims around him, as very hostile to his own existence. And again, the narrative coming from different agencies, the news, the international environment, can reinforce this threat or this fear of ontological insecurity. And so there is a sort of conclusion made most of the time non-explicitly by this kind of people that nothing can really protect them, neither their community nor the world outside their community. And what we have witnessed is really that the global cities like Boston, New York, Paris, London are major context for this kind of disembeddedness, because people tend to lose communal and family ties. And these two young men were a perfect example of that. They were on their own. Their father left. There were no close family around. They didn't really belong to any of the, ethnic or religious communities I mentioned before. And that's where the second element comes into place. Most of the time we know that young people now get not only information but also guidance online. And in this regard, Muslims are not exceptional, far from it. And so when you have young people who look online, they can find very appealing, not the religious tradition, because to be clear, you need much more training and hard work to get to know the tradition than to listen to preachers or activists online. And this is much more appealing, and it does fulfill or give a sense to this disembeddedness. So in this sense, the radical or ideologized vision of Islam conveyed by some jihadi groups provide a response to this kind of isolated or disaffected person. Why? Because it teaches three things. First, you cannot find peace within your community or your family, because both have been corrupted by the West, and the secular influences. And this is one of the underlying message of lots of these activists online. Second, you cannot be safe because the West is hell-bent upon the dissolution of your group, which is this abstract, Islamic belonging. And Third, the only meaningful community you can join now is the global jihadi community. So this is the second element. But even though we can argue that disembedded people who watch or listen to radical activists online do not, go and plant bombs, there is a third element we have noticed. You need a personal contact. And what happened is that Tamerlan went to Dagestan over the summer, last summer, and he encountered people who usually are young, educated, charismatic, and that's also this kind of personal contact that precipitates or crystallizes this sense of a need to act. One final point, because I think I have overpassed my time here. It's very important to understand that this is not about religion as a spiritual quest. It may be seen this way by lots of young people. But what we know is that people who have not been socialized, and I'm not talking about educated in an intellectual way, but not socialized in any Islamic teaching or lifestyle. And this is the case of a lot of converts in the West, for example, or people who had this kind of a secular upbringing like Tamerlan and Johar. They tend to be much more vulnerable to the radical speech online because they have no points of reference to compare to. So in one word, if I can finish, in the West, we need more Islam in terms of religion. When I say this in Europe, they excommunicate. We need more Islam and much, much less the ideological position on Islam that actually come from Muslims, but sometimes also from non-Muslims. Thank you.
Thank you. Zilka, Spahic, Siljak, you come from, your home is Sarajevo. I'm wondering what looks familiar, what looks different. And thank you for being here.
So thank you. I'm glad to be here and share some of my experiences from Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Balkans region. I will try to make some comparisons, what I have experienced there. Basically, at the beginning of 1990s, what people in the socialist Yugoslavia faced was a revival of religions, but most importantly, competing ethno-nationalistic ideologies and agendas with two big great state projects from Serbia and Croatia. So the war in the Balkans was not religious war, it was economic, political, but religion became part of that war at some point, and unfortunately religion was misused to such extent during the war and after the war that most of us who are religious didn't dare to use it as an argument in peace and reconciliation. Why? During the war, we were also surprised, like Bostonians here and many Americans, what's going on to young people who graduated here from school, had everything available. People in the Balkans, and especially we in Sarajevo, became astonished in 1992 when the aggression started and when we come under the siege, because people who lived with us as our friends and neighbors, godfathers, who studied in Sarajevo, who were lawyers, poets, medical doctors, immediately at the beginning of the war went on the hills and started shooting on us. So one couldn't understand at that time how it has happened. I had neighbors in my building where in one family, father was on one side, one son on the other, second son on the third side, because the family was mixed. They were Serbian and Croatian in the family. Father stayed in the Bosniak army in Sarajevo. One son went on the hill to shoot over Sarajevo, and the third son later joined the Croatian forces. So imagine how to live with that and how to understand your pre-war neighbors, friends, and even teachers. Because, for instance, Nikola Koljevic, also war criminals, was one of the par excellence teacher and poet at the University of Sarajevo. And I recommend warmly the book of My Lives by Alexander Hammond, Bosnian writer who lives in Chicago, who explained that very well. So we couldn't understand, because in Sarajevo, under the siege in the 3.5 years, 11,000 people have been killed. 1,300 children. So every day, approximately 8 people have been killed. So such kind of terror, and from the people who used to live with you. So how to explain that? It was really hard, and even today we are not able to grasp and to understand and to cope with that. But of course, what I want to share with you, that right after the war, people from Sarajevo, from Banja Luka and other cities didn't want to feel defeated. They want to say no to nationalism. They want to say no to fascism. They want to say no to ethnic divisions. And immediately after the war in 1996, they started crossing the borders. And among them, women were the most courageous, the most active. I don't want to essentialize female qualities for peace, that they are better peacemakers than men. But the fact is that women were the first one who crossed the borders, who started and initiated peace activities, and they are still on the front lines in Bosnia and entire region. When it comes to interfaith dialogue, the dialogue goes on 3 levels in Bosnia and in entire region. Institutional, which means that inter-religious council at the state level initiates some activities consisted of religious leaders from Islamic community, Orthodox Christian, Catholic, and Jewish community, and they do some activities. But unfortunately, that Interreligious Council was formed in 1997 under the pressure of World Council of Churches. They didn't want it. But it's important, at least formally, to have that body at the state level and to have them on some occasions, at least for holidays, to send some positive messages to people. But they did their job. The second level is faith-based organizations who started using religion as an argument in peace after 2000. Because before that, they didn't dare, like many of us, as I said. So these faith-based organizations were mostly and primarily initiated by Franciscans in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Franciscans who lived in Sarajevo, and 2 of them I would like to say 2 names, Marko Oršulić and Ivo Marković, doyens and pioneers of interfaith dialogue in that region. They motivated many of us to join them and to become involved in interfaith dialogue. And I would like to share good information. Recently in Doha, Qatar, at the international conference, one of these organizations headed by the woman interviewed for my book have been awarded by the prestigious award for peace as one of the 3 most important interfaith initiatives, which is really amazing because that initiative involves Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia. And the third level is secular human rights organizations and women's organizations. They have done the crucial part of peace building and reconciliation activities. They have started first. They dared, during the war and right after the war, to use religion and to provide room for religion in peace and dialogue, but not as the key argument, but just as one argument among others. And they have been doing an incredible job up to date. And as I said, primarily women's organizations are the most active there. I don't have time to talk about their projects, But these interfaith activities, I would like just to mention one of them, initiated by Medica Zenica and women from Europe, 7 countries from Europe, Lebanon, and Turkey. And in the last 12 years, they have been doing interreligious learning in Europe. And one of the lessons we learned, all of us there, when they came to Bosnia a few years ago, and they want to have Muslim-Christian dialogue. In general, I don't have anything to do against Muslim-Christian or Jewish-Christian, Jewish-Muslim. But having experience in Bosnia and the visions there, and what I learned from my colleagues and friends, Franciscans, for these 3 monotheistic religious traditions, it is important always to insist to have dialogue between the 3 all the time. Because if we exclude somebody at this point, somebody will exclude that somewhere else. We learned that. And the lesson we learned at that time when women from Switzerland, Austria, Netherlands, and several other countries came to Bosnia, Muslim women from Lebanon didn't want to participate to the interfaith dialogue where Jewish women from Sarajevo participated. And I said, this is Bosnia and Herzegovina. This is the model we nurture here. This is the model we advocate here. You came here as a guest, and I hope you'll respect your hosts and accept this, because Jewish women and Jews in Bosnia and Herzegovina doesn't have anything to do with Jews in other countries. So they are friends, they are neighbors, and they are doing interfaith dialogue all the time with us. And I would like you to accept this. In your country, you can organize it in the way you want. And it was the important lessons that we need to take into account when do interfaith dialogue, not to exclude one another from this, and especially these 3 religious traditions. It is very important, at least for us in the Balkans. And I would like to say something else for the end from these activities where I have been participating. We learned that dialogue doesn't have alternative. But in dialogue, we need to have courage. We need to be honest. We need to be ready for change. We need to show humility. Many times we face the situation when people try to identify you, to say who are you, what you believe. They don't give you a chance to say something about yourself. Very often we had situations when people try to compare their ideals with your practices and try to make judgments about you through that lenses. Very often also people were not honest in dialogue, they were not ready for change. And if you are not ready for change in interfaith dialogue, you will have just nice social or academic exercise. That's it. Because in that process, we always change ourselves. And very often, people tend to complain and blame others. And they are not self-critical. But for the interfaith dialogue, what we learn, it is important to be self-critical out of your own faith, to be responsible for others and to be responsible for the general good. And usually, when people start complaining, I listen, and then I say, okay, complaining phase is over. So now it's time to be constructive. What you are going to say for your future? I have complained? No. I have hope. I have vision. I have dream. I have something positive to say. And I believe that we need to encourage people to do that and not just do complaints as they tend to. Thank you.
Thank you. Harvey Cox, it's always a pleasure to see you, and I'm sure you're halfway into a book on this subject. I can't wait to hear it.
Thank you, Chris. 50 years ago this year, a bomb was exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, on Sunday morning while Sunday school was in progress, killing 4 young girls. Their names were Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robinson, and Cynthia Wesley. 3 of them were 14, one of them was 11. Birmingham, the black community of Birmingham was seething, as you might imagine, with rage, anger, and the lust for revenge. Martin Luther King immediately came to Birmingham. He'd been there just a few weeks earlier, leading the famous demonstrations that some of us at least saw, with the fire hoses and the dogs. It was my first year working with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the organization he founded and directed. He immediately told everyone, black community and others, revenge is not what we're about. We're going to respond to violence with nonviolence. We're going to mount an even more ambitious campaign of nonviolent resistance here, marches, sit-ins, the rest, nonviolence. So I suppose what I want to say here today is the appropriate response to violence by people of faith is an increased awareness of the absolute necessity in our world today of nonviolence as a way of dealing with conflict, interfaith conflict, international conflict, racial conflict, whatever. Now I want to point out also that although the last century in which this and many other, Birmingham was of course the center of a lot of bombings. Some people began calling it Bombingham just because of that. Ralph Abernathy's home was bombed, and Martin Luther King's home had a bomb set there, but he was not present at the time, the place he stayed in Birmingham. However, this is a way of looking at reality and looking at conflict which goes way back. I think it goes back at least to Jesus of Nazareth, who told us about loving your neighbor, but also loving your enemy. That's a rather new note in most religious traditions, turning the other cheek. Now, for many people, for many centuries, this was something you did on a personal level with neighbors, with family, but it was not a socially appropriate or politically appropriate way of approaching things. It was Mahatma Gandhi, never a Christian, although he said deeply influenced in his life by Jesus, especially by the Sermon on the Mount, who transformed nonviolence from an immediate personal strategy into a social strategy, and was able to organize thousands, indeed thousands, perhaps millions of people in India to overthrow the British Raj, non-violently, which he did. And I can tell you now that Martin Luther King learned a lot from Gandhi. He read Gandhi in seminary, and on his staff, a friend of mine, James Lawson, a Methodist, black Methodist pastor who had worked in India for Gandhi, was the main trainer, training cadres, groups of young people throughout the South in nonviolent resistance. It didn't stop there. In fact, I want to make the case that nonviolence, as we came from the 20th into the 21st century, was alive and well and had some very remarkable accomplishments. Very remarkable accomplishments. I have written down here the fall of the Berlin Wall. Think of those people walking up and down in candlelight processions on the east side of the wall, joined by those on the west side of the wall, singing "We Shall Overcome" in German, until the East German authorities realized that there was no point in trying to suppress this militarily. Or think of the Tahrir Square, from which we heard such wonderful reporting from you, Chris, from Tahrir Square in Cairo, where hundreds of thousands of young Egyptian people maintained the most remarkable nonviolent discipline, despite provocations, beatings, shootings, being knocked around. In fact, they even provided a perimeter around their demonstration, checking on people to make sure they weren't entering with guns or weapons or knives. Now, it doesn't always work, of course. We think of Tiananmen Square in Beijing, not too many decades ago, where they simply brought out the tanks and literally crushed the nonviolent demonstrators. We think of the somewhat mixed results of the Buddhist monks in Myanmar, who left their monasteries and marched for justice there. However, Even though it seemed a failure at the time, things are changing in Myanmar. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning, I think. So my one contribution here, drawn from my own experience of many years, starting way back at the beginning of the civil rights movement, is there is only one reasonable approach and response. There's only one response that has any logic or makes any sense today to acts of violence, and that is a non-violent response. Not just a passive response, an active, non-violent, confrontational response with those who are the sources of evil.
Thank you. Thank you. Rabbi Sally Finestone leads a congregation in Wayland, and she's also very active on the Harvard campus. Dying to hear your take.
Well, I would like to address this from a pastoral point of view, because many of the students here are currently facing or will face these ultimate questions that are brought to you as a community's pastor. And it boils down to one word, which is theodicy.
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 Not the Odyssey.
No, theodicy. And as any of the students here will tell you, theodicy is the question of the problem of evil in the world. Why does evil exist in a world created by a compassionate and just God? And that's the theological question faced by every religious tradition. That's at the heart of every religious tradition, be it Jew or Buddhist or Muslim or Christian. Why does evil exist in a world created by a good and just God? And it's been the challenge of all religious faiths from the very beginning. We find it early on in the Hebrew Bible. It continues throughout the New Testament. It continues throughout the rabbinic tradition, throughout the Quran, throughout all religious traditions. This is the question that's asked. And it's usually asked in response to tragedy, in response to an evil so large, so widespread, so traumatic that the question cannot be ignored. For the Jewish people, it was asked in the Babylonian exile. It was asked during the oppression of the Romans. It was asked during the years of wandering, the expulsion from Spain. And of course, there was never a period in which this question was asked more intently and with more breaking of heart and spirit than after the events of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, of World War II. And it's a question that we ask as well. People will come to you as your religious leader and say, how did God let this happen? How can this happen? The death of this little boy, the death of these young women. How can God let this happen? And that's the theological question that pastoral leaders will face and do face in the aftermath of something that brings the question home. For many people, they don't think about that most of the time. But then you get something like the events of the marathon, and it brings the question front and center. And religious traditions have had various responses to this. There's the Jobian response, which is, we never really will understand the way God works. God is so different, so greater, so beyond us. All we can do is have faith and hope in God, and it will all work out in God's time frame. That answer wasn't very satisfactory. When Job gave it, it's not very satisfactory throughout the centuries. You have rabbinic and Christian answers that responded by developing a system of rewards and punishment in life after death to try to balance out the complete unfairness of life in this world. So there you have an emphasis on the other world, where true justice will finally occur. You have the mystical response, where it posits that there's something very wrong with creation itself that we have to address in our actions. There's the free will response, that God gave us free will. And once that gift was given, can only sit back in heaven and either rejoice or weep as the human race embraces that free will for good or uses that free will for evil. And it really boils down to the modern question that all pastors help their people come to grips with, which is, how does God work in the world? How is God manifest in the world? Do we still believe in a God that swoops down and divides the sea? Or is God's work through history and through humanity more limited, perhaps by human free will? Is God somehow restrained or diminished by human evil? And is there another way of looking for God's manifestation in the world other than in the events of history, of the news, of human action? Perhaps God is to be found in the response to what happened as opposed to the tragedy itself. Perhaps that is where you find God, in the hands that reach for other hands, and in forums such as this where communities try to come together. So that is that's the question that all pastors will deal with, this question of how do we feel God is manifest in the world? And how is that goodness and justice of God, how is it somehow diminished by the human evil that we often confront? I want to close by sharing one of my favorite passages that goes back actually to Leviticus. In Leviticus, in chapter 19, you're told that if you find the lost animal of your enemy, not your friend, but of your enemy, you have to make every attempt to bring it back. And it seems like a strange request. And the rabbinic explanation of this is like, look, if you bring the animal back to your enemy, he'll have to at least acknowledge it. And then you'll have to at least acknowledge him. And then you'll start talking to each other. And then eventually you'll meet again. And so it leads to dialogue. And so you're not doing it for the animal. You're doing it in order to bring about dialogue with your enemy as the end goal of bringing that little animal back. And perhaps it's in that dialogue that God is witnessed.
Thank you. Thank you all. We're well begun, and we're even approaching the moment when we want to sort of open it up. But I'd like to change the frame, maybe fundamentally, in the sense that not to be looking for religious meaning in it necessarily, but to reflect on the events of the marathon and the aftermath. It's by now a very complicated, multi-layered thing, but simply as people whose disposition is toward faith or belief and conscience and this kind of reflection, but not looking for a religious answer. Specifically, I'm glad you mentioned Dr. King, Harvey. What would Martin Luther King say? I'm willing to bet my bottom dollar that he would ask us, as he did in the last years of his life, in the middle of the Vietnam War, to reflect on the violence in this society, period. On the Friday after the Monday, the day in which on the New York Times, and I keep it, in which the brothers first showed up on the surveillance camera in that color picture, on page 4 of the Times, there was a long and very well-researched piece, well-reported piece from Afghanistan with a striking picture in color on the web of a grave in Afghanistan of, it sort of ran on, but there were 17 civilians killed by a drone attack, supervised by the CIA, without any question about that. 12 of them children, and the children's graves were, lined up a series of mounds that just sort of ran. And I thought, how do we, first of all, I thought, this is us too. This is our work. And how do we grab ourselves and yank ourselves out of this kind of imperial narcissism and sentimentalism about, holy mackerel, 3 people died in our beloved town of Boston, and think hard about the example the United States sets every day and every week of a kind of unbelievable power and intrusive attack. So I'd love to take another quick run at the panel, maybe backwards, but sort of let's leave God, religion, Islam, faith, whatever, out of the account of the event, but sort of as kind of religious people, what else do we make of this event? What do we see going on if we had to just sort of pin the tail on the donkey? Rabbi Finestone. And this can be brief and impulsive. What do you say over the kitchen table?
I think that one of the most important things that all religious faiths emphasize, and this was brought home very much by our remarks about Islam in the West, is the importance of community and how we define who our community is and how communities come together to support each other through these terrible times. And whether, I think part of our response is to examine how can our religious traditions continue to create caring communities, whether it's here in the States or to help create them in other places, so that there is a community to support and to embrace each other. And you know, there was a radio, it was on WBUR, and it was called the Act of Kindness Hour. Did anyone hear that program? They had 1 hour in the week following the marathon bombing in which no news were reported, but anyone who witnessed an act of kindness was encouraged to call in and to describe it. And it was the most uplifting hour of radio I think I've heard in years. And it was the only uplifting hour of radio that I heard. And it created a caring community of listeners just for that 1 hour. And so I think that it is a religious commandment to create a caring community. And I think that's really what we need to strengthen our efforts in doing, no matter where we go.
Thank you. Harvey, your turn.
Well, I think you hit it correctly, Chris, that it should encourage us to look at the society we live in, which is utterly suffused with violence everywhere we look, on our television screens and our video games. Wasn't it the same week as the Boston Marathon bombings that the Senate turned down a modest proposal to ban the sale of assault weapons?
Oh, background.
It was.
Background checks. So, anything. I mean, assault weapons didn't even make it to vote. I think this is really strange to me. I mean, why anybody would think that buying and owning an assault weapon that's obviously designed for other purposes is a legitimate right of every American. I was completely flummoxed by that. I didn't expect it. I don't think those who were sponsoring the legislation expected it to be defeated either, especially the parents from Newtown who went down there to talk with the senators. The other thing, your mention of drones is the rather unsettling idea that as long as we can keep as much violence we're doing to other people out of sight, it isn't going to bother us. We don't see television coverage very often of the drone attacks. We used to see it when it was a war being fought, for example, in Vietnam. Although I have absolutely no doubt that were Dr. King here today, he would do what kind of things he was saying for the last couple of years of his life. That violence against human beings anywhere is violence against people everywhere. And you remember how wildly criticized he was for a public statement he made opposing the Vietnam War 2 years before he died, 2 or 3 years before he died. People said, no, that's not your business. You're in the civil rights business. He said, no, this is our business, this kind of violence that we're inflicting, and you have to address it everywhere.
Thank you. Zilka, please.
So I'll go back again to the Balkans region. I said that religion was involved in the conflict and was misused. And I remember right after the war when we started traveling, especially crossing the border between Federation of Bosnia and Republic of Srpska, that was not easy. And I learned at that time how much listening and communication is important. I remember when I met the Orthodox priest for the first time in 1998, and he even didn't want to greet me and to look at me properly. But our colleagues made jokes with him, trying to make comfort, to soften the atmosphere. And they even said something very, very problematic at that time. They asking him to sing some Islamic songs, spiritual songs there in the restaurants where we met. And the guy told me, I guarantee that hair on your head will stay, but I'm not sure about your head. And then I said, oh my God, there is no way to have dialogue with these people. 2 years after that, my Franciscan colleague again told me on our way back from Belgrade, let's go to visit that priest again. And I said, please don't. There is no way to communicate with that guy. I mean, you remember what he told us. Last time he didn't want to talk to us. And he said, you know, he has been changed. I said, how come? And really, we came to and I forgot to tell, when we entered in 1998 the restaurant, there were around 50 people inside. There was immediate silence. Everybody stopped talking. And 2 years after that, we entered the same restaurant, the same place. Nobody stopped talking. And then the guy stood up and started hugging us and greeting, welcoming, and I was surprised. And then he said what has happened with him and admitted something very important to me, that I was the first Muslim woman he was talking to ever. He was a guy around 55. Imagine he lived in the socialist Yugoslavia and he has never communicated with a Muslim woman. It was for the first time for him to communicate with somebody. And then I said, okay, so communication and listening is crucial. And as a believer, we have so many messages from the Bible, similar messages in the Bible and Hadith Qudsi, when two or more people gather, God is there. Yeah, and that's true. And that holy moment when you listen and communicate is crucial for building relationships. I learned that, and I think that is important to give a chance to people to listen to them and to communicate and to build and rebuild relationships. This is, building relationships peace is about that, basically. So if we want to respond to these kinds of events, either here in the United States or in Europe or anybody else, we need to give a chance to frustrated people to say what they want to say. They are not frustrated for no reason. So we need to give them a chance to say what hurts them.
Jocelyne, please. Thank you.
Your question is interesting because after the bombing with one of my class, we talked about violence beyond the US, and I brought up the violence in Chechnya because everybody was asking me what's going on in Chechnya. And the violence in Chechnya has been humongous, terrible. I mean, and so also talking about the way that the oldest brother has been exposed to this violence was a way to put into perspective this all the kinds of terrible acts that can happen. But I know by experience that this kind of juxtaposition works in rational terms, on paper maybe, rarely with people of flesh and blood, because there is emotion on any kind of information you bring. And if you have not been socialized with what Ralph Ellison called the inner eye, and the capacity to put yourself sometime in the place of the other, there is very, very little probability you're going to be able to look at situation outside your own parameter or context. And in this regard, yes, in the distance you can say the US are very, very concerned by security. And it's true. I mean, we come from Europe, and there is a quote-unquote tolerance to violence, and less expectation on you know, getting 100% safe environment. But what does it change? I mean, at the end, every community has to go through this process of being able to take care of its own, and in the same time understand the other. And honestly, I think it's a civic education. It is not only a personal charge, and it is something that goes with being also aware of the international environment, having a more contrasted and diverse source of information. All this is beyond, I mean, you cannot get reaction of people, positive reaction, by putting together these two pictures on paper.
Thank you. Dean Harvey, before you begin, could I just say I was very struck in one of your memoirs of Belfast 40 years ago. You made a reference, I mean, there were dozens of bombs on some days, and you referred to these were no warning public space bombs. And I thought that describes Belfast, it describes the Marathon Day here, and it describes the drone war, alas. Do you want to tear and compare or connect the dots, or is that even a mischievous association of those three things with these, what you called, no warning public space bombs?
Yeah, I think no warning public space bombs are deeply cruel things. I think I just want to make clear that in Belfast and Northern Ireland, although there were those bombs, the majority were not no warning public space bombs, because they soon came to be regarded as propaganda defeats for the organizations planting them. In other words, if you've got an active political ideology you want to promote, slaughtering innocent people really turns populations against you often. So I think those are the cruelest form of bombs. How to relate it to drones and so on, I'm not sure how to do that, but I'll say this, and this is what your question provoked in me both at the start and at the end, and that is that I think violence instituted by states is troubling and complicated. So in Northern Ireland, the Bloody Sunday events where the paratroopers were involved in killing unarmed people in Derry was a troubling incident that made the situation a great deal worse, or collusion between security forces and some of the paramilitary organizations was a deeply troubling event. So I do think we need to hold our governments accountable for what they do and to be interested in what they do. Albeit being aware that the world is a complicated place. This isn't any kind of defense, but it wasn't easy to be in charge of security policy in Northern Ireland through this time. It was a difficult task, trying to preserve some sort of normal life, whatever that looks like, or a phrase that came to be widely bandied around, an acceptable level of violence. So people in those situations often are taking difficult choices. Often they take bad choices and unfortunate choices. And my final segue there would be into some of the most moving moments that I experienced in the wake of the Boston bombing, was the sense of community togetherness against the outrage that had been committed. Just looking at that and those boards in the Science Plaza at Harvard where people wrote their comments of speaking about compassion and courage and community affirmation and sympathy and empathy. It was just a beautiful set of messages. So I think how we responded, or I've a very vivid memory of being on a panel just like this a week ago at the Divinity School, where the Boston, the head of police, Ed Davis, when asked the final question by a woman who wanted to express her thanks to those who had kept her safe, but was too moved and broke down into tears and couldn't do it, and he just reached out and gave her a hug. But, it was a wonderful moment of constituted authorities and those in our society coming together in some kind of mutual gratitude. That was a good moment, actually, in this situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's the caller's turn. Go to the phones, and we'd love to hear. There are mics. There's a mic to be handed around. Please keep it tight and end with a question mark if you possibly can.
Thank you. This is for Professor Cox. I totally am in sync with you regarding nonviolence response, and for the most part, theoretically at least, and have great concern about the lack of wisdom in Afghanistan and Iraq war, for example. It's ridiculous. But in the bombing situation, obviously I think that it's a matter of nonviolence can be effective if there's time to consider a response and context. And maybe have your thoughts on that in terms of, I mean, obviously it was a massive retaliation by the police, and they had to do it, I suppose. But
well, yeah, I think probably the big question mark that I would put to myself with my illustration from Birmingham is against whom or confronting whom would nonviolence here have been a proper response. But I would pick up on what Chris said about the violent society and the externalization of violence in various places around the world, including the drone attacks and other places. These are proper objects, I think, for nonviolent demonstrations, work stoppages, all the things that have to go into turning the country away from this kind of systemic violence, you might say, of which I think this particular incident in Boston was an expression, albeit an indirect one.
My name is Thomas Frizzell. I'm a Lutheran pastor, also a Navy chaplain. Most interested in the comments on disembeddedness. And I was struck, having served a number of congregations, that if I found myself in a congregation where I feared that folks that looked like me had become radicalized, it'd be very difficult for me to contact authorities. It would be a last resort, really, when I thought something really bad was going to happen. I doubt that if I had a visitor that called me out based upon something I said in a sermon that may indicate that she or he were radicalized in some way, that would not propel me to the ATF or the FBI or my local law enforcement. And so I'm wondering how Dr. Cesari would envision these imams that might work more closely with authorities.
It's not envisioning it. It did happen. In New Jersey a few years ago, nobody knows about that because it doesn't make the news in the sense that nothing happened. But there have been experiences of Islamic leaders warning the authorities about there was a group of Yemeni that were trying to create a bomb. And they just said to the police, that's, you know, it's not about alerting someone, alerting the police about some kind of disruptive behavior. It's about knowing information that are, you know, important to know to prevent any events. We tend to forget that in this country there have been lots of attempts of bombing, and lots of the ones that have been avoided. I'm not talking about people coming from outside, like the one who took a plane and tried to, I forgot his, he has a nickname.
The underwear bomber?
Voilà, the underwear bomber. I'm not talking about those, I'm talking about people who are settled in the US, like these two young men. We know that there have been attempts that have been avoided because Islamic leaders warned the police. That's all I can tell you. It doesn't mean delation, it doesn't mean defamation, it means really things that, and there is a continuous attempt of dialogue. It doesn't mean also going to the police once and knocking at the door when nobody knows you. It doesn't work this way. There are lots, if you want to know, you can consult the sites of a few organizations in Detroit, because also there have been the idea that Detroit is a nest for terrorists, but it's not the case, for the reason I mentioned, which is that it's a very vibrant or set of vibrant communities. So they have very early on take the lead on opening a dialogue with law enforcement. And nobody considers them as traitors or betrayers. So there are ways of doing that. If you just come out of the wood and say, this one is bad, yes, I understand your objection, but it's not the way it's done here.
Okay. Nancy Rockwell, I'm a UCC pastor, and we have been seeing the outflow of people from religious communities in huge numbers over the last decades. And New England has the lowest church attendance. I live in southern New Hampshire, the state with the distinction of having the least church attendance in the nation. One of many reactions, and I share most that I've heard, is that this event becomes one more tragedy for religious communities because these two young men are seen as a product of religion, one more reason to leave religious communities in a culture that is increasingly placing its trust in the police and in a militarized police. I also have great admiration for Commissioner Davis, but I was at moments terrified to see what looked like the National Army, though it was the police, descending on two young men. Though they did horrific things, it was like something out of the Hunger Games. And how then would any of you who are so wise see that we can get this message? Our voice is weaker, our communities are shrinking. How do we make community outside of our fusty, fuddy-duddy, ritualistic, old-fashioned communities of faith that really don't have much to say in the modern world? Our theologies do, but not our pieties, in my opinion and experience.
Very serious question. Interesting, thank you.
Can I try to respond to that?
Sure.
It's a very, very important question. It's a very important question because you are pointing out on something that is a need for expanding what we have in the West limited religion too, which is rituals, you just mentioned that. And there is a responsibility to go beyond rituals or belonging to one particular congregation and to expand this kind of vision outside society. And this is something that is very, very much in demand for the young people. Sometimes they turn away from communities for the reason that they don't get this broader vision. And to go back to your point, these two young men were not the product of religion, quite the opposite.
No, but just speak to, or anybody, speak to this very specific point that it's a blow to religion. This is where religion takes you. And this is what we get from religion. How do we?
I'm sorry.
From religion or from a distortion?
Well, of course, but I mean, the broad lesson, as you're saying, is that it's a blow to the whole idea of religious community. Again, partly because it's been reflexively interpreted as a message from Islam or from Islamic cells or something. But who's to?
Well, that's the way it's been depicted a lot in the press in the weeks since then. How many times have we read that the older brother was just a kind of a party animal running around having a great time, and then, alas, he started getting more religious.
Nobody's drawn the moral that we shouldn't go to parties anymore. Right.
More religious, and his wife started wearing a scarf, and then you see what happens.
Right.
I think making this distinction between religious and distortion of religion is a subtle responsibility that we have, especially when it can be so easily generalized. And I think Nancy's right. There are a lot of people who read this as yet another reason to avoid that stuff.
Short questions, short answers, please. Save your answer.
Thanks. Hi, I'm a student here I'm an MTS student here at the Divinity School, and my question goes a little bit to what we saw emerge on the internet in the days after the bombing, especially the hours and days after the bombing, which was the hashtag Pray for Boston and the memes that were created around that. And so I'm wondering if you guys can respond to the outpouring of religion or faith or prayer that we saw on the internet, and how that may or may not have connected people or isolated people during that process, and whether or not we see this as an emergence of religion or just people turning to something they find comfortable in a moment of trauma or panic.
I personally found it to be a wonderful reminder of the overriding principles that link people of faith, that link religious traditions one to another. That it didn't matter what your religious background was, there was an online community of people who felt that the events required a religious writ large response. And it was just a reminder, certainly to me, that there are more things that should be uniting us in terms of our religious traditions than dividing us. And the trick, of course, is finding those and being able to talk about them and developing them with each other. But I actually found it to be an extremely comforting reaction. And I know that many of people in my community, both here at HDS and also in suburbia land, also found that to be very comforting as well.
Can I just answer a little irreverently that, I mean, I thought the non-religious, the people not going to a religious response was the remarkable thing. I mean, our religion around here is baseball, it turns out, and the Red Sox became, the AP lead on the story the next day was bonded by tragedy. The Red Sox lost overwhelmingly, or won overwhelmingly, I forget which it was, but, and you know, the baseball cap, Boston Strong, and even President Obama's speech was all about setting this whole event in the history of Boston comes back. We were 3 down against the Yankees in '04, and look what happened. And the Celtics, Larry Bird came back, you know. But in some strange way, it was incredibly kitschy, should we say, and it was slightly ridiculous, but in another strange way, it really worked. I mean, the violence did not generate hatred in this case. It generated this kind of go Sox, which is our answer to pretty much everything. But Red Sox Nation came together and sort of kept its cool. And God knows they've been winning like crazy ever since. Anyway, that's just a side answer. There are other quick questions in our vanishing time.
Greetings. I am grappling with my question here. One of the reasons why I'm grappling with my question is because being constantly identified as other when I thought, as I self-identify myself as the same, similar, and consistent, and as long as I am identified as, we have multiple identities here in the US. However, if we keep placing labels or identifying ourselves as others, it's going to become, or is, very problematic to make this situation a healing situation. And I want to know, on the real ground, when we were, Jocelyne talked about flesh and blood, speaking to the masses, I'm one of those people who call the radio station and they say, and there's no Muslim who ever calls in, and I'm the same one that they mispronounce my name every time, and they say that no Muslims ever call in, and they say that we do not understand. I think understanding is going to be in an experiential level, but how in the world can we present and heal if people don't want to listen to things that are healing and loving?
Interesting question. Do we have an answer?
No, I don't think we can have an answer, but
Closer to the mic.
it's hard to have an answer to your question, but you are pointing out to exactly something that can be an object of policy, which is this civic awareness of making Islam, not only Muslims, but Islam part of the community, which is already there. You are a perfect representative of this, presence of Islam among Americans. How can we break away from the vision that Islam is alien, that Islam is external, that, how do you move away or include more, not Muslims again, it's about Islam as part of the national narrative. And this is a big political objective. It cannot be only carried by individuals, and I think that religious communities, all of them, not only Muslim, but Jews, Christians, have a big responsibility in helping change the narrative. If you think of the way that the narrative on African American has been changed in this country, it can be done. But what we learn from the African American experience is the alliance in the civil society of different groups. And unfortunately, I'm not seeing yet this alliance with Muslims in this country.
One more question, please. I saw your hand first. Please.
What do we do about this question about a body that is not able to be buried? Just a few minutes ago, Mayor Menino said that the body would not be received well in Boston to be buried. What do we do as religious leaders, as a civic society, when we say that some bodies cannot be buried?
Well, I can respond to that. I think it's completely outrageous. And any person associated with any of the religious traditions knows that we're all created in the image of God. We're all faulty. We're all sinners, some more than others. But this takes me back to Antigone. Refusing burial is a terrible sacrilege. Really, it's a sacrilege. And I'm just waiting for a funeral director, a person of faith who is faithful in his or her tradition, saying, I'll find a place And I'll take responsibility for this, and that person ought to be there's one. And it should be, help to find a place to bury it, and then religious communities ought to support that, vociferously and openly and publicly, because this is the way God's children must be treated in death and in life. It seems there's just no question in my mind.
We're out of time. I wish somebody would close in prayer in some fashion. Is that the dean's job? Could be a silent prayer if you like. Thank you all, and thanks to the wonderful audience and a wonderful panel. First rate.